Welcome back to Sports and Society in Ancient Greece and Rome. When teaching this class, I always make my students watch the delightful TV series, The First Olympic Games in Athens, a TV series from the 80s which explores the revival of the Olympic Games. One of the things that is communicated in the TV series very well is that the revival of the games was an occasion that required studying the past through texts, images, and artifacts. So, how did the whole system actually work in the past? In the end, if you want to organize an Olympic or a Pan Hellenic festival, how can one go about it? I'm just asking for a friend. In this video, I try to answer all your burning questions, the who's, the when's, the where's, and the how's of the Olympic Games. We look at the Olympic program and how it evolved through the centuries, and we note that throughout the discussion, we will be drawing most of our information from the Olympic Games themselves, since these are the games where most of our information comes from. But we will also supplement our data set with occasional tidbits from the other sanctuaries. So let's start. And the first question we're asking here is, who organized the games? If you were to draft an ad of sorts for Hellanodikai, which is not how they did it back then, but humor me anyways. So the ad would probably say, the city of Viles is looking for a candidate to serve in the elite club of Hellanodikai. The candidate has to be male, a wealthy landowner, usually from aristocratic families, right, from Elis. The candidate, if elected, will have to make contributions, which is time and or resources, towards the organization of the games. As for the perks of the job, you can wear a purple robe, and that's a big deal. You sit at the judges' boxes, and again, that's a big deal. And you oversee the games and, act as a judge. Among your duties, it is to deal with late arrivals, to examine the credentials of the athletes. Note here that in order to participate in the games, especially in the beginning, right, and for many centuries, you had to be a Greek citizen. So the Hellanodikai had to inspect athletes' credentials that proved that they were bona fide citizens of a Greek state. They also had to assign the athletes into age categories, a task that may not be as straightforward as you might think in the absence of birth certificates. They could also disqualify those who, quote unquote, entered solely despite their opponent and supervise a month of mandatory training at Olympia. Last but not least, they judged the events that had the power to punish infractions by imposing fines or order the whipping of an athlete. So, for instance, they could impose fines for withdrawal after the beginning, or fines, or even whipping for bribery or cowardice or behavior injurious to the games, right? Ultimately, the Hellanodikai were the ones who actually made sure that the games were fair and basically assured the continuity of this great tradition. All right, why Elis, you might ask, right? Why only landowners from Elis? And here's where Elis is, right, in Olympia. Well, it was one of the closest cities to Olympia, and after the 570s, it became actually the overseer of the entire district where the sanctuary was located. And of course, it took charge of the festival. Previously, a smaller town, which was actually closer to Olympia itself, by the name of Pisa, was doing the supervision of the games and the organization, and kind of bragged about starting the whole thing to begin with. As you can observe on the map, actually Olympia is kind of out of the way. Notice where Sparta and Athens it is. It's in relationship to Olympia, right? Uh, the trip from these cities, right, Sparta and Athens, must have taken anywhere from 5 to 10 days. Sparta closer to Olympia than Athens. But if you are coming from further afield, the trip was even longer. So, and I'm bringing up these distances, right, and how long these trips are, because I want you to appreciate how significant a trip this was for any athlete and their retinue. Everybody in antiquity knew when it would be time for the games, whether they went to them or not. The games would be held in a period from August to September every 5 years. This 4 year period was called an Olympiad, and each Olympiad was sequentially numbered from 776 BC and onwards. An Olympiad became a unit of time of sorts that was used throughout the Greek world to sync up the local calendars that each city followed. Um, and the Olympic calendar was used by almost all Greek city-states as their kind of calendar syncing system. So if you wanted to refer to a date, you would say something along the lines of the second year of the 20th Olympiad to refer to your desired year. Each Olympiad was named after the winner of the stadium race, right? The premier running race. The names of victors for all the events, and not just the running races, were recorded, and we seem to have names of victors going back to 776 BCE. Actually, this is how Eusebius, a historian of the 3rd century CE, calculated the 776 date for the first organized Olympic Games. We'll come back to the list, so keep them in mind. At the beginning of every Olympiad, about 3 months before the Games, messengers went out to the Greek city-states to inform everybody about the impending Games. The messengers were 3 heralds with olive wreaths and staffs, the spondophoroi, which are not, went to cities and announced the beginning of the sacred truce, or better, the sacred ceasefire. The Olympic truce, or armistice, was meant to protect travelers to and from the sanctuary, and according to Pausanias, its terms were engraved on a bronze discus which was kept in the temple of Hera at Olympia. During the truce, wars were supposed to be suspended, armies were supposed to refrain from entering Elis or threatening the games, and legal disputes and the carrying out of death penalties were forbidden. Nevertheless, I should add here that respecting the terms of this truce was left to the goodwill of the various Greek city-states and were usually, but not always, observed. Early on, the truce lasted for 1 month, but its duration was extended to 2 months and finally 3 months following the games themselves, which were extended accordingly, as we're going to see in a couple slides. The gradual expansion of the Olympic truce shows you that the games did not always enjoy the fame that we associate with them today. If you peruse the victors' lists, you will find that for the first 20 Olympiads, the festival lasted only 1 day and included sacrifice to Zeus, a stadium race, and the prize awarding ceremony. Later on, as the festival's fame grew through the region and later through the entire Greek world, the program was expanded with the addition of more events and rituals that lasted for 5 days. If you continue perusing the same list, you will find that the names of the athletes are consistently Greek up until the beginning of the 1st century BCE, when Roman names start appearing. This is significant because, as we mentioned before, participation in the games required citizenship in a Greek city, a requirement that relaxes after the conquest of Greece by the Romans and its incorporation in the Roman state. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, right? The checking of athletes' credentials by the Hellenodikai took place before the festival began. A month before the start of the games, the athletes would congregate to Iles, where the Hellanodikai were from. There, they would submit their credentials to the Hellanodikai, who would ascertain their citizenship to a Greek city-state. Then they would undergo a month of training and be put on a special diet under the supervision of the judges. On day one of the games, judges, priests, athletes, trainers, and of course the audience would travel to the sanctuary. Everybody had to undergo a purification process before they entered the sanctuary, and then the athletes and judges would take their oath. Pairings of opponents would be made, and then all would enjoy a contest of heralds and trumpeters. By the way, the oath ceremony, which has inspired a similar ceremony in today's games, would happen in the Bouleuterion, where athletes and judges would take their Olympic oath in front of the Zeus Horkias, which means Zeus of the oath. Nowadays, a representative of the athletes, but also of the judges and coaches, take the Olympic oath during the opening ceremony of the Games. The first iteration of the oath that you see taken in the photo of this slide says this: "In the name of all competitors, I promise that we shall take part in these Olympic Games, respecting and abiding by the rules that govern them, in the true spirit of sportsmanship, for the glory of sport and the honor of our teams." And that was an oath by Baron Pierre de Coubertin, and it dates to the 1920. Here's a list of the main events that were included in the festival over time. So I've mentioned already the first 20 Olympiads. The only event was the stadium race. So from 776 BCE to 724 BCE, that was the only event during the festival. After 724, the first two additions to the program were actually foot races. So the Diablos and the Dolichos were added to the program, followed by wrestling as a standalone event, and the pentathlon, which is actually a composite event that included discus, javelin, and the long jump, as well as another stadium race and a wrestling competition that was included in the pentathlon, 5 events. After that, boxing made its entrance, right, in 688. After the expansion of the festival to 3 days, then even more events were added, such as chariot races, the Tethrabon and the Keyless, that is the 4-horse chariot race and the horseback race, the Pankration, and the Hoplitodromos, which means the race in armor. Whether the festival lasted 1, 3, or 5 days, at the conclusion of the program, the audience always enjoyed a procession of the victors, the judges, and the city-state delegations, much like we do today, right, during the closing of the games. During this procession, the athletes would carry palms, the sign of victory. The procession would culminate in front of the temple of Zeus, and there, the senior-most members of the Hellanodikai would stand in front of the entrance of the temple, announce the winners of the various events, and give out the awards among cheers from the crowd. Clearly a great occasion to behold. The rest of the day and night was dedicated to feasting, drinking, and of course singing and general merriment. The prizes of the Olympic Games, as well as other Panhellenic sanctuaries, are a very interesting issue in itself. So in mythical accounts like the Homer's Iliad, right, book 23, the funeral games of Patroclus, there we hear about a number of different prizes like horses and medals and even slave women and other precious items such as tripods. We're going to talk about all the other prizes, but here, let me say a few things about tripods. Tripods, examples of which you see in these pictures, were actually a very common find at Olympia and other sanctuaries. But at Olympia specifically, they're dating to deposits from the 10th to the 8th century BCE. So if you want to see it this way, the time like before the organized start of the games. What is not clear about these finds is whether they were actual prizes or just dedications. Whatever the case might be early on with these tripods, during the official games, right, the Olympic Games that we know from our records, prizes during those games carried no monetary value. Winners were awarded wreaths or crowns made out of the special plant of the god to whom the sanctuary was dedicated. So at Olympia, winners would get olive wreaths. And at other sanctuaries, such as Delphi, right, they would get laurel wreaths. Or Isthmia and Nemea, they would get pine and wild celery wreaths. So each sanctuary had its distinctive floral crown. Athletes would also receive fillets of wool that they would tie up around their arms and thighs. And we see them represent, these fillets of wool are represented very often in iconographic representations of athletes. Here is a very famous statue, the Diadumenos of Polykleitos. This is, by the way, one of the works of art that I would like you to remember for the exam. This is a famous statue, which is preserved only as a Roman copy of the Greek original, and it portrays an athlete who is binding his hair with a tenia, a fillet of wool. I mean, I know the upper part of his arms are missing, and it's kind of hard to imagine what he's doing, but this is what he's doing. Another iconic plant that I mentioned already was palm. Athletes often carried palm as a symbol of their victory. All these trademarks of victory, of course, were nothing in comparison to the fame that the athletes gained with their victory. These prizes might have been of no monetary value, but the symbolic capital that they gained was immeasurable. Some cities would tear down sections of their fortification walls to welcome their athletes back, whereas Athens would reward their victors with free dinners at the Prytaneon of the city and first row seating in public events. It is unquestionable. Winning at one of these Pan-Hellenic festivals made you a big deal. So this is all, folks. I leave you with an image of a decked out athlete after his victory, carrying his palm and sporting the fillets of wool. Thank you very much for your attention.